Hello, my name is Xander. Welcome back to the Python Beginners course. In this tutorial, we take a look at Python while loops. So this is the 9th tutorial in this beginners course, the penultimate tutorial. So like I've already introduced, we're going to have a look at how to use while loops within our application. So let's get started. So let's start by just identifying the differences here between a for loop, which we learned about in the previous tutorial, and now the while loop. So let's try and just break this down a little bit. So the for loop, we've utilized the for loop, and we know that it will it will iterate over something, an iterable, a number amount of times. So we know that if we, for example, iterate over a list that has 5 items, we're going to loop 5 times. So with a for loop, we have this known number of loops or iterations that we're going to process, or we have a number of iterations that we know that we're going to iterate through or loop through. So this is really the main difference here, because with a while loop, here we're going to check a loop condition. So based upon a condition, like an if statement, for example, we're going to loop through or not. So if the condition is true, we're going to loop through. If the condition is false, well, we're not going to loop through. So here we don't specify the known number of loops that we're going to perform. This is all going to be based upon a condition. So let's take a look at an example. Let's make a new variable called I. That's going to equal the integer 1. Okay, so now let's create a while loop. So in this case, in difference here between while and for, we're going to use the while keyword here. And now we're going to create some sort of condition. Right, so let's say while I is less than 6. So what's going to return here is going to get evaluated to true, of course. So while this is true, we're going to perform some additional actions. So let's just print out, for example, true. So the word true. Right, so if we were to now run this, you can probably guess what's going to happen here. That I is always going to equal true. Oh, sorry, I is always going to equal 1, sorry. So this condition is always going to be true. So this is just going to loop around forever. This isn't going to stop, and we can go ahead and do that. There we go. So you may not kind of see this, but this is just going on forever. This is continuing forever. So we can close that by Control and C. So we need to be careful of that. So let's just, every time we loop round, let's print out true. And then we're going to just increment the I. So the variable here. So I now equals or plus equals 1. So we're just going to add 1 to this variable, and then we're going to loop around again. Of course, the first time we loop around, I is going to equal 1. And then the next time around, it's going to equal 2, and so on. So let's just print this out. So you can see that we printed out 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 trues. So when the I got to 6, number 6, because we've incremented it here, then obviously we've broken this loop. This now is false, so we don't run this loop anymore. And you can see we've broken the loop, and we're now outside of the program, or outside of the loop. So as a quick reminder, I've left the information about comparison operators. That's what we've learned in, I think it was section or module 2. Oh, so module 3 of this course, we were looking over the different comparison operators, which can be utilized here also with while loops. So where this gets a little bit more interesting is that we can utilize a while loop with an input. So we can constantly ask the user to keep inputting something until a condition is met. So let's go ahead and just import random, and now let's create an account. So count starts at 0. So we're going to count, and then we're going to have a number. Let's go ahead and let's just start with 0. Okay, so we've got 2 variables here, count and num. And now we're going to get a random number. So let's go ahead and do that. So random.randint, for example. That's going to be a number between 1 and say 10. So what we're going to do here is we're going to generate a random number, and then we're going to ask the user to type in a number. when the numbers match, the random number and the user number, we're going to say correct. Else we're going to ask the user to keep typing in a number until they guess the correct number. So this is where we can use a while loop. So while the num is not equal to the random number, okay, so when our number that the user's typed in is not equal to the random number here, then we're going to create a loop. So we're going to say that num equals, and then we're going to create an input. So enter a number 1 to 10 between, between 1 and 10. Okay, so now we have an input. Now that's going to go on forever until we actually match the number to the random number. So what we're also going to do is just count the iterations. So we're going to take the count variable we've generated or we created, and we're just going to add to that 1. So for every time we guess, the count is going to go up, so we can keep track of how many times the user has made a guess. And then we can outside of the loop, let's go ahead now and print the random number that we're trying to guess. Let's also now print, for example, the guess count. So let's take the guess count and then let's put the count in there. And then finally, let's just print correct. So they know they've got it right. So this code here down here is not going to run until the while loop has broken, until the while loop is evaluated to false while we're not looping through. So let's just give this a go and see it in action. So here, enter a number between 1 and 10, 1. And I was correct straight away. So you can see here, I printed out the count number, or sorry, the random number that was generated for me to try and guess, the guess count, and the fact I'm now correct. So let's just try this again. So I could type in 1 forever here because remember, I've generated a static random number. That's not going to change every loop here. It's just generated at the start of the program. So it's definitely not 1. It's not 2 or 3 or 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and it's 8. There we go. So I've guessed 18 times and I'm now correct. And the random number I was trying to guess was 8. So if I take you back to the previous module where we discussed for loops, there was a few tools that we could utilize to break the loop. And this applies also to the while loop. So for example, we introduced the idea of break using the break keyword, which would break the loop and then return back to the main program. So let's just go through an example here. So we're going to create a number here, which is going to be 1. So we're going to say here, while the number is greater than 0, we're going to do something. So this is going to be true because the number is 1, so it's always going to be above 0. So this, we could just type here true, for example, if we wanted this while loop to always run. So let's go ahead and just print the number, num. So at the moment it's going to print 1. And then let's go ahead now and change the number. Okay, so let's create a random integer. And then we're just going to have 1 to 10, for example. Okay, and then basically now we're going to have an if statement. So if num is equal to 5, then we're going to break, and that's going to break the loop and then return back to the program. And then what we can do then is print 5 was found. So what we're doing here is we're generating a random number between 1 and 10. Let's just change it to 20. So just to take us through here, the number starts here of 1. Is a number more than 0? Yes. So we're going to run the loop. We're going to print the number, and then we're going to generate a new number, and that's going to be placed then into our variable num. So between 1 and 20. Now, if the number is equal to 5, this new number we've generated, then we're going to break, and 5 was found. So what this is a random generator, which is trying then to randomly find the number 5, or when the random number generates 5, it's going to print out. So let's give that a go. So you can see it's generated all these numbers here. Eventually it's generated a 5, and then when it does find 5, it then breaks the loop and then we print out 5 was found. So that's just an example of break. Again, very similar to what we learned in the previous module with for loops. So again, just taking us back to the for loop exercise, we found break, or we utilized break, sorry, and we found out we could also utilize continue. So the difference here is that break would break this loop and we would then continue with the rest of the program. Continue allowed us to instantly go to the next iteration. So with continue, we're allowed to move to the next iteration. So let's just go ahead and just create something here. So I equals 1. So while I is, for example, less than 10, let's print I. Okay, so we're going to print that number. And now let's increment. So I plus equal 1. So we're just going to add 1 each time up until 10, of course. Now let's just do an if statement. So if I is equal to 4, let's just continue. So that's going to tell Python that we just want to go straight to the next iteration without running the next code here, which is going to be let's run an else, for example. Print next. Right, so let's give this a go. See what we've got here. So let's just move it up. So you can see that 1 next, 2 next, 3, and then no next here. So when we get to 4, remember, we're using continue. So that means that we're not printing out next, although we've got a conditional statement here. Clearly we're capturing if the number equals 4, we're going to continue instead of printing out next. So this is probably not the best example, but if you just work through the logic here, we start with number 1, we print number 1. We come down here, we increment, so I now equals 2. So if I equals 4, it doesn't, we're going to print next. So next is printed. Right, so then we do it again. So now we've got 2, so we print out 2, we increment, so I now equals 3. Okay, so I now equals 3. If nope, so we print out next. Right, so now I equals 3, we know this. So we loop again, print I, so we print 3. Now we increment. So I now equals 4. Now if I equals 4, we know to continue. So therefore there's no next here. We just continue to the next loop, 4. So we print out 4 now. And then increment 5. If I equals 4, nope. Okay, so print next. So not a very good example here, but you get the general idea. Continue is allowing me to just go to the next iteration of the loop straight away without running any other code. So to borrow one more thing from the for loop exercise is the else. So like for, we can also utilize else here with the loop. So we can use else. So let's go ahead and print something here. Let's just go for end. Okay, so let's give this a go. And there we go, end. So this else here is going to just allow us to do something or perform maybe an action when the while loop has finished. We just need to be careful here because, for example, I said when the while loop has finished. Now, remember, if we use break here, if we use break here, that's going to break the loop. Now, we could consider the else as part of this loop process. So if we do break, we're not going to print out the end. So just to give that a go there, you see when we get to 4, we now break, not continue, and we don't then receive, or we don't get to the else print end. Of course, the best way to establish a while loop is to think about some challenges and to run through some challenges. So let's do a few challenges. Right, so challenge 1, let's write a while loop that adds all the numbers from 1 to 100. So what we need to do here is output in the terminal numbers 1 to 100 using a while loop. So give it a go. We'll go through the solution now, so maybe you can pause. So there might be a few ways of doing this. Let's just try this. So the number equals 1. So we're going to start from 1. So let number equal 1. So while the number is less than or equal to 100, let's do something. So we're going to print out the number. And then every time we loop round, we're going to take the number or the variable and then we're going to plus equal 1. So we're going to add 1 to it, and then hopefully that will then loop through 1 to 100. There we go. Yep, so we start from 1 all the way to 100. Challenge 2. So let's take the following list. Now I haven't given you any examples here or we haven't worked through working with a list and the while loop. And that's the little bit of challenge here. We need to try and think back to module 7, where we utilized and learned about tuples, lists, and dictionaries, how we actually manage and access data within a list here. So let's take this following list, and what we need to do is we need to iterate through the list, and then for every instance of 100 where we find 100, we need to print out what found one. So here you can see that this list only has one instance of 100, so we need to iterate through and then just print out that. So I'm going to add some more hundreds here in my list so it prints out a few times. So the outcome here, sorry if you're a little bit confused what you need to do still, you need to iterate through, use a while loop to iterate through one by one the items in this list. When you find a number that equals 100, you need to print out found one. All right. Okay, so I've made a slightly different set of numbers here, like I said, so it makes it a little bit more interesting. I've got three instances of 100 in my list. Right, so let's go ahead and first of all, let's go ahead and create length. So let's get the length of this. So the length of numbers. So that's going to tell me how many instances of, or so how many how many items there are inside of this list. Okay, so now I've got that. Now let's set up a new variable called I equals 0. Okay, and this will make sense in a second. So now what I'm going to do is make my while loop. So while I, remember while I at the moment is 0, is less than the length. Okay, so remember here we're calculating the length of this. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. So it's 15. So length is going to store the number 15 and I is storing 0. So while I is less than the length, we're going to do something. So let's say if, right, so now we're going to have an if statement. Right, so now what we're going to do is we're going to check to see if we found 100 here. So let's do this if, and then numbers, I. That's interesting. So what we're doing, what's I? So remember I is this number, it starts at 0. Now remember back to lists, these are indexed. So for example, this number here is index 0. This is index 1. This is index 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and so on. So what I'm doing here is I'm going to use this variable here, this number stored in this variable, to access, in this case, on this loop, the position 0 of this list. Okay, so once I've got that, I need to check, see if it equals 100. So I do that. So if it does equal 100, then I'm going to print what I said. In the scenario, I'm going to print found one. There we go. So now what I need to do is take I, and I just need to increment it. So plus equal 1. So what I've done now is I equals 1. So when I loop around again, I'm now going to look into position 1 of this list and check to see if that equals 100. And I can do the same for the whole thing. So we know the length, so we know when to stop our loop because we've counted the amount of items that are in this list. So once we've got that, we can probably go ahead and run it. There we go. So we found 3 instances of 100 in our list. So next up, using the following list of names. Okay, so we've got 2 names here in our list. Using a while loop, allow the user to add new names to the list indefinitely. Okay, so each time a user adds a new name, ask the user if they would like to add another name. 1 equals yes, 2 equals no. So we need some sort of input to ask the user whether they want to add a new name. If they do want to add a new name, we're going to allow them to add a new name. If they don't, then we're just going to break the loop and stop the program. So we start with our two names. Okay, so let's create a while loop. Now we want this while loop to go on forever, so we could just say true, for example. So as long as it's true, the condition is true, which it will be if we just enter true, then we're going to run the loop. So let's go for names dot append. Now remember from our module, from the module 7, we can append, so we can add items to the end of our list using append. And then what we want to do is we want to input. So let's take an input, enter name from the user. Okay, so that's going to add a new item to our list. So we can then print names. So we can see the new items added. And then what we can do is ask the user whether they want to continue. So let's add another input here. 1, add more, 2, exit, say. Okay, so I hope you can make it more explicit, but you get the idea. Right, so now we ask the user to input 1 or 2, and then we can just have an if statement. So if x is equal to 2, you may guess we're just going to break the loop and then stop the program. Right, so let's give this a go. Enter name. So I'm just going to put x as the name. You can now see at the end of my list, a new name appears. So add more, yep. So absolutely fine. So I'm going to loop through again. Notice that 1 isn't being captured here. It's just going to loop again because while equals true. It's just going to keep looping. So let's go for y name. So now I've added y to the end of my list. And this time I want to exit. So I press 2 and now it's going to be captured by my if statement here. And there we go. The program has ended. Okay, so moving on to the final challenge here. Challenge 4. Create a dice roll simulator whereby the user is first given an option on screen to either play or exit the simulator. And then basically we're just going to roll a dice. So we're going to create a random roll dice and output it onto the screen. So if that didn't quite make sense, what we're doing here is we're going to use a while loop to roll a dice. So we're going to create a random number and it's going to create a random number from a dice. So 1 to 6, for example. Now we're just going to ask the user whether they want to roll the dice again. If they don't, they'll press 2 and that will exit the game. So very similar to the previous task. So again, it might not make sense to you. Still, I apologize. So import random. So while true. So we're going to do this forever. Let's print out, first of all, 1 roll dice, 2 exit game. Yeah, so we could put this on a new line. Okay, so let's just give this a go. You can see that I've got true, so it's just going around forever until I break it. Okay, right, so that's in place. Now we've got that. Let's ask the user what to do. So the user is going to type in 1 or 2. Sorry, so we need an input here. So choose 1 or 2, for example. Okay. Right. So if the user presses 1, then we're going to roll the dice. So the number, the number equals random dot random int, and then the number 1 to 6, comma 6. There we go. So we get a random number. We can of course print this out. So let's just print that out. There we go. And then else, let's break. So if the number if the number the user types in isn't 1, well, they must have typed in 2. So I don't need to explicitly have an if statement for if they press 2. We can just make the assumption, of course, that they've pressed 2 because they've not pressed 1 to generate a new number. So let's press 1. You can see that I'm generating a new number here, and then I'm being asked again whether I'd like to roll the dice again or exit the game. So if I press 2, we exit. So hopefully that gives you a good starting point for utilizing while loops. Hopefully you've got the general understanding now, and we're building from the previous tutorial almost with the for loop, and you can kind of see the differences, but there are some similarities. So there's one more module to go, and that's the functions. So thank you for listening, and I hope to see you in the next tutorial.